England was burning. Monasteries lay in ashes, villages were crushed beneath Viking boots, and one by one, the Saxon kingdoms fell. Only Wessex remained, the last line between freedom and conquest. Out of the smoke and ruin rose a man no one expected to lead. The youngest son of a king, chased into swamps, mocked as a fugitive, and yet from those marshes he would rise to become Alfred the Great, the king who refused to surrender, the defender who laid the foundation of England itself. The England that Alfred was born into was a land under siege. By the mid-9th century, the Viking raids that had once been quick strikes on monasteries and villages had grown into full-scale invasions. What began as plunder had turned into conquest. The Great Heathen Army, as the chronicles called it, had swept across the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Their longships cut through rivers like knives, spilling out warriors who built winter camps instead of sailing home. The Saxon kingdoms, once divided but relatively stable, now faced an enemy that was not just raiding but staying. To the ordinary people, the Viking presence was a nightmare that felt unending. Families lived in fear of smoke rising on the horizon, a sure sign that a war band was nearby. Monks carried relics in frantic escapes, leaving behind libraries that were set to flames. Markets closed when word of a Viking march spread. Whole villages were abandoned overnight. To the people of Wessex, the last unconquered Saxon kingdom, life had narrowed to a single hope, that their rulers could hold back the tide. England at this time was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own rulers, rivalries, and ambitions. Northumbria had already fallen to the Danes. East Anglia's king had been executed, a martyr to Viking ruthlessness. Mercia, once powerful, was fractured and weakened. That left Wessex tucked in the south, as the last stronghold of Saxon independence. If Wessex fell, the entire island might well become a Viking colony. Into this world of uncertainty, Alfred was born in 849, the youngest son of King Bathalwulf of Wessex. No one expected him to inherit the throne. He was the fifth son, destined perhaps for a quieter role, possibly in the church. But fate rarely respects birth order. Through deaths of his brothers and the turning of fortune, Alfred would one day find himself carrying the burden of an entire people. But in his youth, Alfred was not raised only on war. His mother Osber taught him to value learning. There is a story, preserved in the chronicles, of how she once held up a beautifully illuminated book of Saxon poetry and promised it to whichever of her sons could learn it first. It was Alfred who rose to the challenge, memorizing the verses. This thirst for learning would stay with him all his life, shaping the kind of ruler he became. Yet even as Alfred's mind was turning toward wisdom, the shadow of the Vikings grew larger. Their raids pushed deeper into Wessex territory. Fields were trampled, villages burned, churches desecrated. Saxon warriors, brave but outnumbered, clashed with battle, hardened Norsemen who fought with terrifying ferocity. The question was no longer whether Wessex could resist, but how long it could survive. For the nobles of Wessex, loyalty was not always guaranteed. Some thought the smarter path was to make peace with the invaders, even if it meant bending the knee. Others clung fiercely to the idea of Saxon independence, but fear could sway even the strongest. Alfred grew up watching this uncertainty, nobles whispering in halls, alliances shifting, the people caught in the middle. The church also played a part. Bishops urged the kings of Wessex to see themselves not only as rulers of land, but as defenders of Christendom. To them, the Viking threat was not only a matter of borders but of faith itself. The Danes, after all, were pagans, worshippers of Odin and Thor, and their arrival tested the Saxons' sense of identity. To lose to them was to risk not only slavery or death, but spiritual defeat. By the time Alfred was a young man, the world around him was scarred by war. The England of his childhood was a land of fear and fire, where every dawn could bring disaster. And yet, within this crucible of destruction, Alfred's character was being forged. His story would not be one of peace inherited, but of survival fought for. He was to become the defender of the Saxons not by choice, but because history left him no other option. When Alfred finally took the throne in 871, it was not under peaceful circumstances. His older brothers had ruled before him, each trying to stem the Viking tide, and each had fallen in the struggle. Alfred himself had fought alongside them, gaining both scars and wisdom. By the time he was crowned king, Wessex was battered and weary. The people were tired of running, tired of seeing their crops burned and their churches stripped of gold. They needed more than a warrior king. They needed someone who could organize, inspire, and give them hope of lasting survival. Alfred was not the tallest or the strongest of men, but he had a different kind of strength. He was thoughtful, deliberate, and keenly aware of the weaknesses of his kingdom. He understood that the Saxons could not simply match the Vikings in brute force. The Danes were fierce fighters, trained from boyhood in the art of raiding, and they thrived in sudden, devastating attacks. If Wessex was to endure, Alfred would have to change the way his people fought, lived, and even thought about their kingdom. One of his first great reforms was military. He reorganized the Fyrd, the part-time militia of farmers and villagers who had always been expected to take up arms in times of crisis. In the past, the Fyrd was often slow to gather, and many men had to return home to tend their fields before a campaign was finished. Alfred solved this by creating a rotating system. Half of the men would serve in the army, while the other half stayed home to work the land. This way, Wessex could always field a force without starving itself into collapse. It was a simple idea, but it gave the Saxons a steadier, more reliable defense. Alfred also understood the value of fortifications. He ordered the construction of burhs, fortified towns built at key points across his kingdom. These were not just military strongholds, but centers of trade and refuge. Each burh was carefully placed so that no Saxon would be more than a day's march from safety. For the first time, ordinary people had a place to run to when the Danes came raiding. The burhs turned the landscape into a network of resilience, and together they formed the backbone of Alfred's defense. But Alfred's rise was not built on war alone. He believed deeply in the power of knowledge and faith. He saw that many monasteries and schools had been destroyed in the Viking onslaught, and with them, much of England's learning. To Alfred, this was a tragedy. A kingdom that could not read its own laws or preserve its history was a kingdom that risked losing its soul. He personally took up the cause of education, translating important works from Latin into English so that his nobles and clergy could understand them. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, determined to make Wessex not only a shield against the Danes, but a light of learning in a dark time. These reforms began to knit Wessex into something stronger than it had been before. The people started to believe that their kingdom could do more than merely survive. Alfred's laws, his insistence on justice, and his efforts to blend Christian faith with good governance gave his rule a moral authority that few kings had wielded before. He was not content to be a war leader. He wanted to be a king who shepherded his people, body and soul. Yet his rise was never without tension. The nobles, whose loyalty often shifted like the wind, sometimes bristled at his insistence on discipline and organization. For men who were used to independence, being bound into Alfred's system of burhs and rotating armies felt restrictive. But Alfred knew that survival required unity, and he pressed on with a patient but firm hand. Step by step, reform by reform, Alfred was turning Wessex into something new. It was no longer just a kingdom scrambling to avoid defeat. It was becoming a kingdom with a purpose, with defenses rooted in planning rather than chance, and with a people bound by more than fear. Alfred was building the foundation for resistance, not just against the Vikings, but against despair itself. Alfred's reforms gave Wessex a backbone, but reforms alone could not stop the storm. The Danes were relentless. They came in great numbers, their longships gliding up rivers, unloading war bands that struck fast and with savage efficiency. For years, the Saxons fought them in skirmishes and pitched battles, and sometimes Alfred tasted victory. but more often he was fighting just to hold the line. One of the earliest tests came soon after Alfred's coronation in 871, a year the chroniclers called the Year of Battles. Within a few months, the Saxons fought at Reading, Ashdown, Basing, and Meriton. At Ashdown, Alfred's courage shone, while his elder brother hesitated to join the fight. Alfred charged first, rallying the men with his boldness and turning the tide to secure a rare victory. But victories were fleeting. For every triumph, there was another bloody loss, and Alfred's army, though disciplined, was stretched thin. The Danish leaders were cunning. Guthrum, in particular, proved to be one of Alfred's most dangerous opponents. Unlike some raiding bands that came for plunder, Guthrum aimed for conquest. He sought not just treasure but territory, land to settle, farm, and rule. This made him a far more persistent foe. Time and again, Guthrum's forces clashed with Alfred's, and time and again, Wessex teetered on the edge of collapse. The darkest moment came in 878. That winter, the Danes launched a surprise attack on Alfred's royal stronghold at Chippenham. It was the dead of winter, a time when most expected armies to be resting. Alfred was caught off guard. His court scattered, his warriors slain or captured, and he himself barely escaped with his life. For a time, the dream of Saxon independence seemed over. The King of Wessex had been reduced to a fugitive, hiding in the marshes of Somerset. Yet it was in those bleak marshes that Alfred's legend grew. Cut off from power, he refused to surrender. The stories say he disguised himself as a commoner, moving quietly among the people, gathering news, and seeking loyal men who would still fight. In one famous tale, while hiding in a peasant woman's hut, Alfred was asked to watch her cakes baking. Distracted by his troubles, he let them burn, earning her scolding. The story, whether true or not, became symbolic. Even in disgrace, Alfred endured humility, a king brought low but not broken. From those swamps, Alfred began to rebuild. Slowly, word spread that the king still lived, that he had not yielded to the Danes. Men began to slip away from their homes and join him, forming a small but determined force. By spring, Alfred had gathered enough to challenge Guthrum again. He chose his ground carefully, calling his loyal Fyrds from across Wessex to meet him at Edington. The Battle of Edington was the turning point. Alfred's army, smaller but disciplined, formed a solid shield wall against Guthrum's Danes. The fighting was brutal, axe and sword clashing against wood and iron, cries filling the air. But Alfred's men held firm. Hours dragged on, the shield wall straining, until at last the Danes broke. Guthrum's warriors fled to their camp, and Alfred pursued, laying siege until hunger forced them to surrender. What made Edington remarkable was not only the victory, but what followed. Alfred demanded not just tribute, but conversion. Guthrum and his closest men were baptized, with Alfred himself standing as godfather. It was a symbolic act, pagan invaders submitting to Christian kingship, and it cemented Alfred's position not only as a military leader, but as a defender of faith. Even after Edington, the war did not vanish overnight. Viking bands still prowled, raids still came, and Guthrum's treaty did not bind every Dane. But the tide had shifted. Wessex had survived its greatest test, and Alfred had proven himself not merely lucky but resilient, resourceful, and divinely favored in the eyes of his people. The conflict with the Danes defined Alfred's reign. It scarred the land, filled graveyards, and left villages in ruins. But it also forged unity among the Saxons. They had followed a king who did not abandon them in defeat, who stood with them in the marshes, who rebuilt when all seemed lost. Out of blood and fire, Alfred's Wessex emerged stronger than before. Victory at Edington gave Alfred breathing space, but peace was fragile. Guthrum and his followers had accepted baptism and withdrawn into East Anglia. Yet not all Danes followed suit. Smaller war bands still prowled the coasts and rivers, striking where defenses were weak. And while Alfred's reforms and victories had proven his strength, he now faced another enemy, doubt within his own kingdom. For all his achievements, loyalty among the Saxon nobles was never certain. The nobility of Wessex and Mercia were proud land, owning men, used to guarding their own power. Some respected Alfred's vision, but others resented his growing authority. His insistence on new laws, fortified burhs, and a disciplined army sometimes clashed with their desire for independence. To Alfred, unity was survival. To them, it felt like a chain. When times were hard, whispers began to spread, perhaps a separate peace with the Danes was wiser than endless war. This wavering loyalty cut Alfred deeply, because he knew that betrayal could undo everything. If one ealdorman or thegn defected, it opened the door for the Danes to strike again. In the marshes of Somerset, when he was a fugitive, he had already seen how quickly allies melted away in fear. Even after Edington, that memory haunted him. He understood that the true battle was not just against swords from the north, but against weakness within his own people. There were moments when betrayal nearly broke him. At times, nobles failed to bring their men when summoned, leaving Alfred dangerously undermanned. Some openly negotiated with Viking leaders, calculating that a quiet deal would save their estates. To the common people, these betrayals were invisible. They only saw the king holding the line. But Alfred knew the cracks, and he worked tirelessly to seal them. What kept him from despair was his conviction that loyalty must be nurtured, not forced. He turned again to his reforms, strengthening ties between crown and people. His system of burhs made nobles directly responsible for defending their regions. It bound them into the larger survival of Wessex. If a noble betrayed Alfred, he was not just betraying a king but abandoning his own people to slaughter. Alfred's laws also sought fairness, ensuring that justice reached even the poorest farmer. In this way, he earned the love of the common folk, who in turn pressured their lords to remain faithful. Still, tension lingered. The Danes were clever in exploiting it. They sent envoys with promises of peace, gold, and independence. To a weary noble, those offers were tempting. Why bleed your men and risk your land for a king's vision of unity? Alfred had to answer that question not only with words but with his life. He lived simply, avoiding the pomp that might alienate his followers. He prayed openly, presenting himself as a servant of God as much as a king of men. His humility, rare for rulers of the time, convinced many that his cause was not self-interest but the survival of Christendom. But betrayal was never fully banished. Even years after Edington, there were nobles who leaned too close to the Danes, who measured their loyalty by convenience. Alfred bore this burden with patience, though it pained him. He once remarked that a king's crown was heavy not because of gold, but because of faithless men. And yet, through persistence, Alfred managed what few rulers could. He balanced suspicion and forgiveness, authority and humility, discipline and mercy. He did not eliminate betrayal, but he kept it from destroying the kingdom. His ability to hold Wessex together, despite doubt gnawing at its core, was perhaps as great a victory as any won with sword and shield. For the story of Alfred is not only about battles in fields and marshes. It is about the quiet war in men's hearts, the struggle between courage and fear, loyalty and treachery. By enduring betrayal without losing faith, Alfred proved not only his strength as a leader, but his depth as a man. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind a kingdom scarred by war yet stronger than it had ever been. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival ended with the foundations of a united England. His legacy was not simply that he defended Wessex from the Danes, but that he built a vision that stretched beyond his own lifetime. Alfred had transformed the idea of kingship, weaving together military strength, learning, faith, and law into something enduring. His greatest military legacy was the network of burhs and the reformed fyrd. These defenses did not vanish with him. They remained, shaping the survival of his descendants. Later kings of Wessex, like his son Edward the Elder and his grandson Ethelstan, would use the structures Alfred built to expand their power northward and eastward. Without Alfred's groundwork, they could never have dreamed of uniting the Saxon kingdoms into one. But Alfred's legacy was not just in walls and armies. He was called England's teacher, as much as its defender. His translations of Latin works into English opened knowledge to those who had been cut off by language. He believed that wisdom should not be locked away in monasteries, but shared with his people. Under his reign, learning became an act of resistance, proof that Wessex was not only surviving, but cultivating its spirit. Even centuries later, when England faced new challenges, chroniclers would look back to Alfred as the king who restored light in an age of shadows. Equally important was Alfred's vision of law. He did not see justice as the king's whim, but as rooted in divine order. His legal code blended Mosaic law, Christian ethics, and Saxon custom. It was designed not only to punish wrongdoing, but to uphold fairness across the kingdom. In this way, Alfred laid the groundwork for the English tradition of law as something larger than any one ruler. A legacy that would echo through Magna Carta and beyond. Spiritually, Alfred's role as a Christian king was central to how his people remembered him. At a time when pagans seemed unstoppable, he positioned himself as God's instrument, a shepherd protecting his flock. His insistence on Guthrum's baptism after Iddington was not only a diplomatic act, but a declaration that Wessex stood firm in its faith. The Saxons saw in Alfred a ruler who carried both sword and cross, who defended not only their lives but their souls. Perhaps his most lasting legacy, though, was his example of perseverance. Alfred had known defeat, humiliation, even exile. He had been reduced to hiding in swamps, mocked in legend for burning cakes while lost in thought. Yet he never abandoned his people. That resilience, rising from ashes to lead again, became the defining mark of his reign. In that sense, Alfred taught England something more valuable than military tactics. He taught it how to endure. His successors recognized this. Edward the Elder and Athelstan would go on to claim lands once lost to the Danes, and eventually Athelstan would be hailed as the first king of a united England. But even then, it was Alfred who was remembered as the Great. He had not conquered the whole island, but he had preserved its heart and planted the seed of unity. Without him, there would have been no England to unite. Centuries later, when English kings faced invasion from Normans, Scots, or French, Alfred's memory remained a rallying point. Even Victorian historians, writing 1,000 years after his death, praised him as the model of a just and wise ruler. His name still carries a kind of quiet authority. Alfred the Great, the king who defended a people and gave them a vision of themselves. In the end, Alfred's greatness lay not in a single victory, but in the way he bound a fractured land together. He took a kingdom on the brink of collapse and gave it strength, order, and hope. He turned despair into resilience, survival into renewal. For that, he is remembered not only as the defender of the Saxons, but as the father of England itself. Alfred's reign ended not with conquest, but with survival, and from survival came renewal. He left behind a kingdom that had been battered, yet unbroken. His walls, his laws, his faith, and his vision of learning outlasted him, carried forward by his sons and grandsons until the dream of a united England became real. Kings would rise and fall, invaders would come and go, but Alfred the Great stood apart, the king who turned despair into hope, the fugitive who became a founder, the man who gave England its soul.